Everyone, welcome back to part 2 of the digestive system. So last time we talked a little bit about the spaces leading into the GI tract, the oral cavity, the oral pharynx. Now we're going to talk about some of the structures that are in the abdominal pelvic cavity. So if you remember, all the spaces of the body are going to be lined with serous membranes. Abdominal pelvic cavity is no exception. Here, the serous membrane is called the peritoneum. The peritoneum, like all serous membranes, has two layers. It has a parietal layer, which is in contact with the body wall, and it has a visceral layer, which will be in contact with the various organs. Now, way back in day 1 of anatomy, I said that here in the peritoneum is a big complicated mess, and we're not going to worry about it till the end of the semester. Well, here we are, near the end of the semester. Now we need to talk about the particulars of this structure. So, here to here, right, this is the abdominopelvic cavity. It is lined with a serous membrane called the peritoneum. So here in orange, all going all the way around, we have the parietal peritoneum, which is going to face the outside, or it's going to be in contact with the body wall. We have the visceral peritoneum, shown here in blue, because it's in contact, in this case, with the liver, contact with the stomach, contact with the colon, contact with the small intestines. Excuse me. So when the visceral layer of the peritoneum is in contact with the organs, it's shown in blue. Now we're going to have these other structures. These other structures here are called mesenteries, or the lesser omentum, the greater omentum, mesentery proper. What these are two layers of the visceral peritoneum coming together, making a structure. So let's walk through this and see if we can make this concept clear. In orange, in direct contact with that body wall, that is the parietal peritoneum. Right in between the parietal and visceral peritoneum, you're going to have a peritoneal cavity filled with serous fluid, right? Just like all the other serous membranes we talked about. Now here's where it gets complicated. That parietal layer is in contact with the body wall. The visceral layer is where it gets confusing. So right here, this blue is the visceral layer of the peritoneum in contact with the liver. One goes on the anterior side, the other membrane covers the posterior side. Now here, these two layers of the parietal peritoneum come together, these two layers of the visceral peritoneum come together, and they're going to extend and reach towards the stomach. When they touch the stomach, they're going to go back to being the visceral peritoneum. But in this in-between space, in between the liver and the stomach, right, this little region of visceral peritoneum, double layer visceral peritoneum, is called the lesser omentum, because it will extend from the liver to the lesser curvature of the stomach. We'll get to the structure of the stomach later. Then the visceral peritoneum is in contact with the stomach, and then you're going to have a big sheet or a big apron. Apron is going to drape off the stomach and cover your other intestines, and then it's going to come back up and be in contact with the colon and stomach. Right? This is called the greater omentum. Also, just a double fold of the visceral peritoneum. Likewise, here we have the parietal layer of the peritoneum. It's going to branch out and make a structure called the mesentery proper. The job of the mesentery proper is to support and connect all the various twists and turns of your small intestines. So here is mesentery proper. When that actually reaches and then surrounds an organ like your small intestines, then it goes back to being the visceral peritoneum. I should also point out that there's some organs here that are not completely surrounded by the visceral peritoneum, like the stomach is, like the liver is. These organs back here, the pancreas and the duodenum and parts of the colon, are posterior to, they're behind the parietal peritoneum. They're not encased in the visceral. They're behind the parietal. These organs are referred to as retroperitoneal. They're behind the peritoneum. So we got a lot going on in this image. Let me try and sum it up one more time. Peritoneum is the serous membrane covering the abdominal pelvic cavity. The parietal peritoneum, shown in orange, is in contact with that body wall. If the visceral peritoneum is in contact with an organ, you just call it visceral peritoneum, shown in blue here and here. When that layer leaves that organ and jumps to another structure, right, that gets a special name. It's usually called a mesentery or omentum or something like that. So this one, where the visceral peritoneum jumps from the liver to the stomach, is called lesser omentum. The structure hanging off the greater curvature of the stomach is called greater omentum. That layer of peritoneum supporting the intestines is called mesentery proper. So the function of all these mesenteries is to support and organize and like hang the organs inside the abdominal pelvic cavity. It also provides a pathway for blood vessels and nerves to reach these organs. So take a little bit of time and make sure you get these structures kind of clear. Okay, let's go through the words just to make sure there's no confusion. Right, organs completely surrounded by the visceral peritoneum are called interperitoneal, inside the peritoneum. They include the stomach and the vast majority of the small intestines. The duodenum or duodenum, the first part of the small intestine, is not included in this, but the rest of the small intestine is. Organs in direct contact with the posterior abdominal and pelvic walls and are only covered on their front surface, only covered on their anterior lateral surface with visceral peritoneum, are called retroperitoneal organs, the ones behind. These guys right here, pancreas, duodenum, parts of the colon, are behind the peritoneum. So ones you should be aware of: pancreas, ascending and descending colon. The transverse colon is actually suspended by the visceral peritoneum. That's called transverse mesocolon, but I'll get to that in a second. And the rectum are also retroperitoneal. Okay, so what are these mesenteries? Mesenteries are folds in the peritoneum that support and stabilize organs in the abdominal cavity. They also provide a connection for blood vessels, nerves that supply these various organs. Let's talk about mesenteries that we need to know for this class. The greater omentum hangs like an apron off the greater curvature of the stomach and is going to cover the rest of the organs in your abdominal cavity. The lesser omentum connects the liver to the stomach and part of the duodenum. So the duodenum is when your stomach meets your small intestines. That short first section of small intestines is called the duodenum. Next one, the mesentery proper, is what's going to support the vast majority of the intestines in your abdominal cavity. The mesocolon is going to support the large intestine as it moves across your abdominal cavity. So going back to the picture, lesser omentum, greater omentum, mesentery proper, right? And not super well, here's the mesocolon. So the mesocolon is going to extend basically from anterior to the pancreas and is going to come across and support your large intestine out in front. So lesser omentum, greater omentum, transverse mesocolon or mesocolon, mesentery proper. So you should know to what structures these various things connect. It makes it easier to identify them. Okay, so this is an image of a human being whose abdomen has been opened up. So there's the liver, there's the empty stomach. Connected to the stomach is this yellow, funny-looking apron thing. This is greater omentum. Like the old term for this, for cooking, used to be called caul fat. So many animals will have this. So You can ask any of your grandmas out there if they ever use caul fat when making meatballs or something like that. It's kind of a weird spider webbing looking stuff, and it was used to wrap things up. Do what you will with that. So if you were to take this structure hanging off the stomach and flip it up, this is what you would see. So this is the greater momentum hanging off the stomach. This is the anterior surface. You lift this up to see what's underneath. There's that greater momentum. Here is your large intestine, right? That's the transverse colon. Transverse colon is supported by the transverse mesocolon. That's the omentum supporting the transverse colon. The transverse colon is the one that is transversing, right, your abdominal cavity. These little small tubes down here, those are your small intestines. So here you have mesentery proper, which is going to support the small intestines. So greater momentum, transverse mesocolon, and mesentery proper. Okay, so let's switch gears a little bit and start talking about very small things. We need to look at the histology of our GI tract. So the GI tract is made of 4 tunics, 4 layers. So going from the inside out, superficial, from deep to superficial, they are mucosa. The submucosa, the muscularis, figure out what's in there. And then the outermost layer is called adventitia, or sometimes it's called serosa. And we'll talk about why they have 2 different names. So this is a generalized picture of the gastrointestinal tract. What this is actually showing is a cross-section of the small intestine. Notice this thing here says mesentery. That means mesentery proper in this particular instance. But these layers are consistent throughout. Slight differences here and there, but in general, you're going to have these 4 layers: mucosa, submucosa, muscularis, and adventitia or serosa, depending. So what is the mesentery? What is that thing made of? Those are just layers of the visceral pericardium going from one organ to another one. When it surrounds the organ, right, that same tissue, then you would call that visceral peritoneum. Serves as the conduit for arteries, veins, blood vessels, and nerves. Now, since we're on the topic, I'm going to address this adventitia versus serosa thing. If an organ is interperitoneal, it's completely surrounded by the visceral peritoneum. The outermost layer is called serosa. So if you're covered with a layer of the peritoneum, your outermost layer is called serosa. If the organ is retroperitoneal, it's behind the peritoneum, it is not covered by the visceral peritoneum, your outermost layer is called adventitia. So that's the difference between serosa and adventitia. Interperitoneal organs have serosa. Retroperitoneal organs have adventitia. Do you need to know which is which? Yeah, yes you do. Okay, let's get back to the big picture here. So here we have a cross-section of the small intestine. We have a space in the middle called the lumen, and any space of the body are going to be lined with what? You guessed it, epithelium. So we're going to have first an epithelium. Deep to the epithelium, we're going to have what's called the lamina propria. So the lamina propria is made of connective tissue, which is going to support and stabilize that epithelial tissue. Now, deep to the lamina propria, we have the Muscularis Mucosae. Be careful here. The Muscularis Mucosae is a very thin layer of smooth muscle. That's part of the mucosa. The Muscularis Mucosae is not part of the muscularis. Don't confuse these 2 things. This thick muscular wall, that is part of the muscularis. This is a really thick layering of smooth muscle. We're not talking about that yet. We're just talking about the innermost tunic, the first innermost layer called mucosa, which is made up of an epithelium, lamina propria, which is connective tissue, and then external to that, we have the Muscularis Mucosae, a thin layer of smooth muscle, right? Don't confuse that with other layers. The Muscularis Mucosae gives you a clear boundary between the next most external layer, and that is the submucosa. So the submucosa will have submucosal glands for the production of all kinds of stuff, lots of blood vessels. And on the outermost layer of that, we're going to have the submucosal nerve plexus. So remember, a plexus is a complicated interconnected network of nerves. So we have one layer, one nerve plexus right here, in between the submucosa and the muscularis. So outside of the submucosa, external, superficial to the submucosa, we have the muscularis, which its first layer is an inner layer of circular smooth muscle. So if this is the tube of the gastrointestinal tract, they're going like that. So when this inner layer gets small, right, because that's what smooth muscle does, it contracts. When the circular layer gets short, it's going to decrease the lumen of the small intestine, or the GI tract in this case. It's going to clamp down. Then we're going to have another layer of nerves. We're going to have a lot of nerves in our GI tract, right? This is called the Menteric nerve plexus. Outside of that, we're going to have another thick layer of smooth muscle. This one's called the outer longitudinal layer. So again, if this is the tube of our GI tract, when this outer layer of smooth muscle gets short, it's going to make your intestines shorter. So inner layer of smooth muscle makes the lumen smaller. The outer longitudinal layer of smooth muscle makes the intestines shorter. These two muscle groups working together is how you're going to do peristalsis and how you're going to do segmentation. All right, outer layer connective tissue. In this case, we have a serosa. This organ must be interperitoneal. If it was retroperitoneal, this outer layer would be called adventitia. So that is a breakdown of all the various histological layers in our GI tract. One thing I want to point out, right, we didn't talk about any of these nerve stuff in the nerve section, but there's an entire division of the nervous system we didn't even talk about called the enteric nervous system. And the enteric nervous system is very large and very complex and is really part of your visceral sensory and autonomic nervous systems, right? So these are things you generally are not consciously aware of. Like if I asked you, you know, what was the pressure in your jejunum, right? You wouldn't be able to answer because you're not consciously aware of this. If I asked you to flex the distal part of your ilium, you would look at me strangely because that's something you're not consciously aware of. But I want you to understand that there are more than 40,000 neurons in your enteric nervous system. 40,000 neurons is equivalent to a cat's brain, right? So your intestines have the computing power of a cat's brain, which is pretty impressive if you think about it. And if you sit and think about it, it kind of makes sense because there's many decisions that have to be made. You need to measure salt concentrations and acid concentrations and when to neutralize the acid and how long should something stay in this particular region of your stomach before it's passed on to the duodenum and then the stomach acid gets neutralized. There's just millions and millions and millions of decisions that need to be made. So you need lots of specialized receptors, lots of sensory information. You need to have very precise control of each tiny little segment of your GI tract, and that takes a lot of computing power. So those people who like to say they think with their stomach, there really is a lot of truth to that because, again, you have the equivalent of a cat's brain down in your gut. I could talk more about that, but I'll just let that sit for right now. Okay, let's break down each of these layers. So the mucosa, innermost layer, you're going to have an epithelium because epithelial tissue lines all surfaces of the body. Deep to that, you're going to have a layer of areolar connective tissue because that's good at binding things together, and because it's connective tissue, it will have or contain blood vessels to feed those deeper structures. Then superficial to that, we have a very thin layer of smooth muscle called the Muscularis Mucosae. Do not confuse this with the muscularis. Muscularis mucosae is different. It's part of the mucosa, very thin layer. But look for it because it makes a very clear boundary layer between the mucosa and the submucosa. Submucosa, lots of lymphatic ducts, right? So remember, back in our lymphatic section, lymphatic system has something to do with processing dietary fats or the absorption of dietary fats. You're going to find lots of mucus-producing cells. Your intestines need to make a lot of mucus because it helps protect the wall of your intestines, help keeps bad bacteria out, and it helps material make its way through your GI tract. More large blood vessels, and then also in the submucosa, we'll find the submucosal nerve plexus. Superficial to that, we have the muscularis, an inner layer of smooth muscle, right? Then we have an outer layer of smooth muscle that's longitudinal. In between the two, we have our second plexus called the menteric nerve plexus. Okay, outermost layer, the fourth and final layer, it depends if you're interperitoneal or retroperitoneal. If you're interperitoneal, you have a serosa. If you're retroperitoneal, you have an adventitia. Both of them are made of connective tissue, elastic fibers, collagen fibers, support and stabilize the various organs. What are going to support the various organs? Well, arteries and veins, or at least the arteries, I should say, celiac trunk, superior and inferior mesenteric arteries. This is just to remind you. We've already covered blood vessels. I'm not going to go out of my way to cover them again. As far as lymphatics, remember, we had special lymphatic vessels draining the intestines. These were called lacteals, and they had a substance in them called chyle, which was like a white milky substance, because this is how dietary fats are going to be absorbed and transported in the GI tract. When you guys get into physiology, you'll talk about exactly how this works, but you really can't have large amounts of fat floating around in your circulatory system. It's not going to work. So dietary fats are going to be shunted to the lymphatic system on their way to be absorbed and processed into the rest of the body. So here in the GI tract, the lacteals, they're going to drain into the cisterna chyli, if you remember. Also in the walls of the GI tract, we had various malts, which were a type of lymphatic nodule, right? These were lymphatic nodules associated with mucosal membrane. So this is a malt, a mucosa-associated lymphatic tissue. In the small intestines, the malts there have a special name and they're called Peyer's patch. So they're just malts in the small intestine. We're going to have lots of nerves entering and leaving this area. They're more or less going to follow the arteries and veins as they make their way through the various mesenteries. So the nerves that come in along the celiac trunk, that follow the celiac trunk, they're going to be called the celiac plexus. The nerves that are going to follow the superior and inferior mesenteric arteries are going to be called superior and inferior mesenteric plexus. The nerves are just simply going to follow the blood vessels. That's the takeaway here. That brings us to the end of part 2. Right? We have the next section, part 3, which is probably the single largest section of this material. And then we'll have a fourth, very brief part 4, where we're going to wrap it all up. All right, take care. See you next time.